Welcome to the Power Hour 2023 edition. I'm Dr. Caroline Heldman. I'm the Executive Director of the Representation Project, and I am so excited to start us off in the new year with a luminary, Sonya Holt. Let me tell you about this incredible interview that we're going to do today. Sonya recently retired from the Central Intelligence Agency, where she served as the Deputy Associate Director of the CIA for Talent, for Diversity and Inclusion, and also the CIA's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. As a veteran officer who served almost 4 decades at the CIA, Sonya served as the senior advisor to the director of the CIA, was a member of the leadership team, and had strategic oversight of all things DEIA in the CIA. She previously served as the lead for the Directors Advisory Group on Women in Leadership, where she oversaw an increase in women's leadership from 31% to 36% during her time there. Sonya has also worked at the Department of Defense, CIA's External Advisory Board, and at the Directorate of Science and Technology. She is the first and only woman to serve as the chair of National Urban League's Black Executive Exchange Program Executive Advisory Council in its 45-year history. And Sonya was in the Hall of Fame in 2012. She has received the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, which is the highest honor bestowed to retiring officers. And she was named the top DE&I executive to watch in 2022 by Washington Executive. Welcome, Sonya. That is quite a resume, 38 years in service. So let's start at the beginning. Tell us about your personal journey. What inspired you to go into intelligence? Was this something that you dreamed of as a little girl?
Well, first, thank you, Dr. Heldman, for having me today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I can tell you as a little girl, first thing that I can think of that I wanted to be when I grew up was a police officer, believe it or not. Had nothing to do with the CIA, but that didn't fit well with my mother's vision for me, right? So I'm the youngest of 5, and I will tell you, I'm the only child of, the only one of the 5 that has a college degree. And I got that while working at the CIA. My dad worked for the government. My mom did domestic work. And so for me, it was either you join the government, you join the military. And college wasn't one of those things that was part of the conversation in the household, right? And so graduating at the age of 17, I did some temp work at the Department of Labor. I had applied for a position at the CIA. They had a recruiter that came to my high school, and we took tests and that sort of thing. But nothing, really resonated with me to say that's where I want to be, or that's the career that I'm looking for. It just so happened that maybe a couple of weeks before my 18th birthday, I received a phone call that said, "Hey, we would like for you to come in for a polygraph." And I'm like, "Okay, so when do you want me to come in?" The date that they said was on my 18th birthday. And I said, "But that's my 18th birthday." And the other person on the other end of the phone said, "We know, we've been waiting for you to turn 18. So of course I go in, and I got hired within 7 weeks, or onboarded 7 weeks after my polygraph. I didn't really know that much about the agency, so I learned everything that I now know while working there. It wasn't on the forefront, but what I can tell you is that it's been 38 amazing years. And if I were to really think about looking at career opportunities, I wish I had done some exploration about what the agency offered, right? The overseas opportunities, all of those sorts of things. So I kind of really fell into it. It wasn't something that was planned, but definitely something that turned out to be probably one of the best decisions of my life.
So Sonya, you obviously passed the polygraph test and 38-year career later. So I'm curious, As a little girl, you wanted to be in law enforcement and then chose a path or fell into a path with the CIA. That's unusual, right? For little girls to be inspired to do something along those lines. What was it that drew you to that? Was it the sense of justice? I mean, what was appealing to you?
And I think it is really along the lines of the sense of justice. And the thing about it is, my dad always wanted to be a police officer. So I don't know if it was the connection of watching, and emulating what he would look at. I mean, he always had the bumper stickers, he had all sorts of things. So I think a part of it was me being immersed in it within, hearing and seeing his thoughts behind it. But I will tell you the unique thing now, I'm a mom of a 37-year-old young man, and I never told him what my desires were in the sense of being a police officer. Well, my son is now, he's in law enforcement. He's a special agent. So I don't know if it's something that's in the blood, but definitely, now that I look at it, I still have that interest. And so the shows that I'm drawn to are around, law enforcement and that sort of thing. So it's definitely something that's deep within, but wanting to make sure that everyone has equal rights, that's treated fairly. And then certainly, I kind of see some of that going hand in hand into the field that I, just really left, making sure that there's equality and that there's fairness, and how do we educate people to get them out of, some of the ruts that life throws in front of them. So
Well, that's a great segue to the next question about some of the experiences you have had as a woman of color in the CIA and throughout your career. You're in these masculinist spaces. You're in spaces that don't traditionally hold much space. If you're not a white man, to be very frank about it, right? So how have you navigated these spaces and how have you overcome these challenges?
yeah, I can certainly tell you that I've had to deal with some of those challenges, but mostly early on in my career. Um, and I saw it more being based around me being a woman and probably my age. There was nothing that I can really pinpoint to say, that my race had anything to do with it. Not saying that it wasn't a factor, but it wasn't something that was sitting out in the forefront. So I worked in an office, for example, with this manager who had come from working in hardware and the technology side of things, of the house. And the only woman that worked for him in that space was a secretary. And that's what they were called back at that time, secretary, and she was a Black woman. And so when he came into our customer service division, which was now reorganized, I was the only holdover from everybody else in the division. They asked me to stay on based on the relationships that I had with some of our external customers. But I soon learned that I wasn't valued at what I was bringing to the table. I was approached by someone that he brought into that office. Um, I'm at their microwave, and this gentleman says to me, he goes, "Oh, I understand you chair the users forum, and this is dealing with information systems." And I said, "Yeah, I do." And first words out of his mouth is, "Not anymore." I'm like, "Excuse me?" And so I go to my now new boss, and he goes, "Well, yeah, I think you've done it long enough, but you can go to the meetings and you can take his minutes."
Hmm,
Right.
hmm.
So um, that right there showed me that I was dealing with something completely different than what I was accustomed to. And so me being the strong personality that I am, and the strong person that I am, even though I was in my 20s at that time, I pushed back and I said, absolutely not. I took my own minutes at my meetings, he can take his own. So that caused for a contentious relationship between myself and this manager. But it got to the point where I was like, I didn't want to go to work anymore. I couldn't stand going to the office. So I went to the division chief and I said, look, you all asked me to stay here because of X, Y, and Z. And I said, but this is what I'm experiencing. And they asked me to give them some time. And then they brought me back in and said, if you have any more issues or challenges with this person, let us know. And he's gone. And I didn't have any more issues with him. So I was fortunate that I had a leadership team that was very supportive and stood up for me in a moment that I needed them to. And so that worked out to my benefit there. Another area, when I was thinking about the age piece of it, I was selected for a position, and again, early 20s, and it was leading a specific program for the office, or actually for the building that I worked in at that particular time. The deputy chief of the office hired me for that role. But the chief, who was a white woman, said to him, I think she's too young. I don't think that she has enough work experience. And, I really rather have someone else. And he pushed and said, no, I think she'll be fine. But he came to me, he says, I want you to know that she doesn't want you in this job. And so I appreciate his transparency in that. But I did the only thing that I knew how to do, and that was to go in and to be the best officer that I could in that position. 6 months later, she came to me and she said, I need to see you in my office. And so in the back of my mind, I'm already hearing the dialogue that this woman didn't want me in this role. But she apologized. She said, I owe you an apology. And she said, I initially didn't want you in this position because I didn't think that you were old enough to handle the responsibility. You have proven me wrong. And she says, so for that, I apologize. And she didn't know that I had known what she had said. So again, I appreciate her owning, but also respecting me enough to apologize for her thoughts based on my age.
That seems like a rare occurrence when someone apologizes for bias in the workplace. My goodness.
Yes.
So I got this great advice years ago about not burning bridges, right? Where you have these moments where you've obviously faced some form of bias or discrimination. And sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's a microaggression, sometimes it's overt. And I got the great advice that in that moment, you really want to burn things down, but don't do it. Don't burn it, because it's actually a bridge, and at some point you're going to use it again. And it sounds like that's very much been your approach to manage the situation in a really direct way, and then just prove yourself. Right, the adage that we have to work twice as hard in order to make the same impression. It's obvious that's something that has worked really well for you. Along those lines, what were things that kept you up at night 38 years at the CIA, and how did you overcome them? What was your approach there?
Well, the most recent thing that kept me up was Executive Order 13950. I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but the previous administration had put out an executive order on combating race and sexism and leading diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And now I'm being told that you can't do any diversity training, that there's certain words that you can't use in the workplace. And that if by any means, if anyone thought that you were going against this executive order, that they could call this hotline and report you, right? And so the keeping up at night piece was, now, how do I now continue to move this agency forward in a space where now, my hands are being tied in some ways of trying to do my job. So I, thought about it, and I was like, okay, what can we accomplish now that we can't do training? I had officers that were coming to me and saying, well, what are we going to do? We can't have our employee resource group things. I said, no, time out. We're going to work this. And I was fortunate to have a great leader at the agency, director, deputy director. They gave me authority to come up with a plan and to work the plan as I saw fit. and that they would support me in whatever that is. I also had a great legal team that worked with my office. So I had a lawyer that was assigned to me to support DEIA and all things. And so they were my partners, right? And so coming up with this strategy and putting out a workforce message of telling folks, because at that time I'd already embedded DEIA activities throughout the agency, throughout our mission centers, throughout our directorates. And so it was on full steam ahead. Now you're putting the brakes on. Now you've got these, I can't say numbers because there was a classified, but we've got all of these people who now have to be managed in a sense of, I no longer can just give you carte blanche to go off and do X. Everything has to come through me, right? And so the management of it was a lot of work, a labor of love, but every document came across my desk, every workshop that they wanted to do, every session. So I read hundreds of documents during that period of time. And some of them, each of them had hundreds of pages. But that was to keep the agency out of trouble. And at the end of the year, knowing that the general counsel would have to do a report, had to turn over everything that I approved, every bit of work that was done, for them to now write their report and turn it over to that administration. And so, of course, that was a time where it's like you having to keep the morale up at the workplace, but also being able to move things forward. And my understanding is that we're probably one of the only government agencies that didn't shut down during diversity, equity, and inclusion. I can tell you all of the other IC agencies even stopped their employee resource group activities and everything else. We didn't do that. And I think having that legal team to work in partnership with, having leadership support, giving me that, realm to go ahead and do what I thought was the best for the organization. And so that's how I handled that piece of it. It's really, the other piece is when you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, we all know that there's an element that always sees themselves outside of the fray of what that really is. And so now how do you make sure that they feel included, right? And so it's about educating, making people see that they had added value. So it was now weaving that into so that white men weren't feeling like they were left out, but also knowing that when people received roles, opportunities, and positions, it wasn't because of their gender, it wasn't because of their race, it was because of the skills and abilities that they had. So it took a lot of behind the scenes, educating, building trust, building relationships. And I think that was really helpful in moving things forward.
Okay, so you're laying out your strategy. This is, again, a great segue to the next question. You're laying out your strategy for how to do effective diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility work. And you did it with your hands tied, essentially, right, during a period of time when it was not politically feasible to do that. Companies struggle with this. Governments, agencies struggle with this. Academic institutions struggle with this, but there's been a new emphasis on this. Can you talk about what some of these struggles are, what's more effective, what is less effective, and why you think some companies really continue to struggle making any progress when it comes to DEIA?
Yeah, so I think in some of the companies that I've sat on councils with or that I've had conversations with, the placement of DEIA, number one, for me has been a red flag. I've seen it embedded so far down within organizations that if you're not empowering the individual or the team to move things forward, I will be the first person to say, and I'll probably get a lot of heat for this one, when I hear that chief diversity officers, for example, fall under HR. I'm like, why? Why? this role should be a standalone position that reports directly to the CEO or, the deputy CEO or, someone at that level. Because, and if they don't have a seat at the table, if they don't have a voice, to me, that's a red flag and kind of says that where's your value proposition on this really? Because now I've got how many layers above me that I now have to either persuade, dissuade, or have to take their thoughts into consideration before making a decision. I think for me, the successes that we've had is Director Haspel elevated my position to be, for example, Deputy Associate Director of CIA. The Chief Diversity Officer position was never at that level before her elevating me at that role, which means all the heads of our directorates, mission centers, I'm now their equal. They don't intimidate. They don't have a position or a level where I now have to feel like, well, if I say something back or if I don't, roll things out in a way that they see fit, that how is that going to come back? No, it was a level playing field where I was able to voice my opinion and feeling. Serving as a senior advisor to the director, meaning I'm having those one-on-one meetings. There's nobody else in the room, other than their chief of staff or someone like that, right? And so positioning matters. The resources that you put alongside of it, you build teams for everything else, but yet I see a lot of companies that have 1 to maybe 3 people, and you expect people to work miracles when you've got thousands of employees and you're only putting 3 people or 5 people against what? Changing the culture of an organization, educating the workforce, right? So you've got to put your money where your mouth is. You've got to be able to ample up the resources. I had for a government organization and probably in DEIA, I honestly don't know any other company or organization that had equal or as many folks that we had lined up to work in this space. There was a whole team that worked accessibility only, right? There's a team that worked with employee resource groups. There's a team that worked on the education piece. I had a team that did our key performance indicator dashboards. So there were individuals, multiple individuals that worked and were aligned to all of these things. And as you mentioned earlier in the opening, I have oversight over all things DEIA. That means even though I didn't lead the recruitment office, when it came to diversity recruitment, I could go in and kind of say, well, where are your challenges? And have all of them brief me. And then I give them feedback and say, here's what I want to see. Here's what we need to change. Talent management, whether it's succession planning, it's promotions, all of those different things, writing of policies. Those policies came across my desk and I got to weigh in on those comments. Key performance indicator, key job expectations. Every employee had a DEIA key job expectations. So we wove it all throughout the organization. And so when you put lip service to here's what we want, but we're not giving you the resources, but yet you look at other problems, issues, challenges, and you give someone an issue and they're like, we're going to put a team, we're going to work this. Well, why can't we do the same thing for diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, and there's the blueprint. So you've just laid it out for corporate folks who are watching this and want to know what they can do. It's a matter of making sure that you have funding, that you have people, that you have proximity, and that you have norms and rules that go along with that. So essentially, having power to actually make decisions rather than the lip service that it is often paid. And you've had great success in increasing the number of women in particular. And of course, in DEIA work, it's focused oftentimes or hopefully on increasing the number of women, of people of color, of people with disabilities, fat folks, queer folks, transgender folks, older adults. and folks with intersectional identities, and creating spaces where it's not just a matter of bringing folks in, but that they feel included, that it's an inclusive space. How did you do that with gender, and what can we learn from that for other identities in the workplace?
So when I was the lead for the Directors Advisory Group on Women in Leadership, so I came in on the second year. So I do have to give kudos to Lori, who was my successor for the first year. And what she did on that first initial year was to socialize it with the workplace, right? So it was, let's talk about the DAG. Let's brief the management and leadership and workforce on, here's what we're trying to do. The initial problem set that was brought to then Director Petraeus's attention was that there were women who weren't achieving positions of great responsibility at the same rate as men, and they weren't being promoted at the same rate. And so Lori did that the first year. I came in on the second year as her deputy, as her equal, and continue to socialize, right? But there were 10 recommendations or mandates that we then moved to recommendations, that we had volunteers from across the workforce to work. We had a small full-time team that worked this for 5 years. It was a 5-year initiative. We were only given 5 years to make progress against this. And so it was like, how do we do this with a limited number of people? So with all of these things, we put out calls for volunteers from across the agency. So it's a grassroots effort. So whether it's sponsorship, whether it's working on feedback, whether it's working on workplace flexibility, all those different topics, people had the opportunity to sign up for something that meant something to them, that spoke to them. Then we had senior leaders, and I'm talking about, heads of our directorates or mission centers who were senior executive sponsors, in the sense that these groups could go to. If I was working on sponsorship, this was my person for that. If it was something on technology, it may have been our CIO or chief of our diversity directorate of science and technology, right? Having all of those, so you had all layers of the agency involved in this. So one of the things that I recognized when I came in, I said, well, Lori, I don't see a lot of men involved in this. And she said, yeah, I don't either. I said, do you mind if I do a little research? And I said, and I don't see a lot of people that look like me as a part of these teams. So I went out to some of my male counterparts, colleagues that I'd known, and I said, why do you think men aren't, why would you not? It says, oh, because it's for women. And then so I went to some of the women that looked like me, and I said, well, why aren't you volunteering? It was because we had other ideas of things that we thought that should be tackled. And we don't think any of these 10 things address interests or areas that, speak to us and that we really wanted to see on the forefront. So I had conversations with both of these groups. I'm telling the women of color, it's like sponsorship, feedback, all of these different things you can benefit from. They may not have been what you are looking for, but you're thereby widening the gap if you don't participate in them, right? If you're not coming to the table, coming to the workshops. For the white men and for the men in general, and I was like, okay, Lori, we need to do something with this name, because when they hear women in leadership, they're checking themselves out because they don't see themselves as a part of this. So we start calling ourselves the DAG. We didn't change any of the recommendations, but if you think about sponsorship, everybody can benefit from sponsorship, right? But our goal was to say, why is one group or someone else receiving more than someone else? And so teaching managers how to span their workforce, even for those silent and reluctant leaders and everyone else, giving people opportunities. If we talk about feedback, making sure that you're not just going to someone when they do something that you perceive as wrong or that could be improved upon. And so I started teaching my team, even after I would give a briefing and say, okay, give me some feedback. Teaching managers and people saying, that was great. If you have the opportunity to do it again, here's something you may want to consider. So you can do it in a palatable way, building trust. And so we start permeating those sorts of things throughout the agency. The other piece is equity assurance training. We built out training for anybody who sat on selection panels, interview panels, and promotion panels. You had to take the training, you had to pass it every 2 years, and it didn't matter what your role was in the organization. If you did not take the training, if you did not pass it, you could not sit on any panels, including myself, right? And so it gave you the opportunity that when you were on these panels, that you weren't hearing conversations where, well, Sonya may not be able to do this. She's got a small time out. You're calling people on the carpet. And so the accountability wasn't just with that diversity rep who would be on the panels. It became everybody's responsibility. So it started to heighten or raise their awareness as to roles and then things that they should and shouldn't be saying. So I think that's one piece of it. But when we started really looking at when we're taking people out of opportunities for growth, so if I were a spouse going overseas with my husband or my partner, and and if I'm an analyst, but there isn't an analyst position for me in the field, well, we're taking that officer, that woman, out of her role of expertise to do something that then off tracks her from the possibility of promotion. Well, why can't we have her do the work overseas? It may be in a different time zone. Let's figure this out, right? Whether it's job sharing or if it's, trusting and understanding that people don't have to be under your sight as a leader or manager to do their job. So we've had to change the mindset of managers. We had to change the mindset of the workforce. We did workshops, we did training. And I will tell you, the COO, excuse me, was really on the forefront of a lot of this in the sense of getting her buy-in. And I gave exposure to a lot of managers. The director was on board with all of this. So it took a lot of work, but I think the intentionality of it and with those managers and senior executives being involved, with people now being a part of the solution and not having something done to them because they're now volunteers that are part of this, something that they were proud of to share with their colleagues and everyone else. So it just kind of permeated in that way that it was grassroots, but everybody had a role and responsibility. And so when we had those panel conversations, people's mindsets were a little bit more open in the sense of, making sure that they're looking at merit versus all of these other things. And I'm happy to say that by the time that I retired, even though that program ended in 2018 because we finished our 5 years, we were at 36%. When I retired, we're close to 39%. So we're still moving forward in getting women in leadership roles because I think it was changing the culture and changing mindsets. And it wasn't easy work, but if you stick to it and you keep working at it and you meet people where they are and educate them versus chastising and telling them what it should be, asking them the questions as to why you feel this way, and then helping them to work through it. So there was a lot of that. And so I think that really helped us because people now had an understanding.
Thank you. And I have one last question before we hop into the Q&A, and it's right along those lines, Sonya, which is why it matters to have underrepresented groups in the CIA or other government agencies, especially in positions of leadership. Why is this so important? And I can hear the critiques, right, about the CIA traditionally being an organization, that has historically had issues oppressing people of color, and that it's not necessarily an agency that you would think you would be doing any sort of justice work in per se. Audre Lorde's quote, right? The master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. And just your thoughts on that, why it's so important, even if you have an issue with the CIA, why it would be so important to have better, more diverse representation in that agency?
Absolutely. So, I've got two areas that I'll address on this. The overseas piece, I mean, it's about national security, number one, right? And so it's about being able to have people to meld into different environments. And so people looking like me completely can't go into every country. People like you can't go into every country, right? And so we need to have people that have cultural awareness that are able to bring in their thoughts, their ideas, right? And so the different perspectives, and the more that we open our aperture and, expand and bring in other people's thoughts, questions, the better that we are at problem solving, right? And so if you stay too narrow, you miss a whole lot. One of the things that when I used to go out recruiting at college campuses, I had a student that said to me, well, why should I come and work at the CIA and all those sorts of things? My son was a college student at that time as well. And I said, look, I do this work. Me, a woman of color, I work for this agency so that my son, so that you and everyone else in this room have the freedoms to walk about every day and not have to worry about a terrorist act, happening. We may not be able to stop everything, but I will tell you that the colleagues that I worked with are working around the clock to keep everyone safe, right? And so for everything that you don't hear about, I can tell you that there are things that people are stopping on a daily basis so that we have the freedoms. And so if we're not willing to lean in to help to make sure that our democracy is safe and to make sure that we have the freedoms to go to college, to go across state lines, to go shopping, all of those different things that we take for granted, right? And so having people that work for this agency and the rest of the intelligence community agencies and our military and everyone else, we're able to do those things because people are willing to work in public service for the safety of this country, for the love of this country, and for the love of the folks that we live next door to.
Thank you, Sonya. And we have one question in the Q&A, and I'll tack on to it. And folks, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We will get to them. The question is, what advice do you have for early career DEIA professionals? And I'll add on to that, what advice do you have for folks who want to go, traditionally marginalized people who want to go into intelligence?
Okay, so for the DEIA professionals, I would say if you can get any certifications, I will tell you the University of South Florida, and I can't remember, the Mamba School, they usually have certification programs. They cost you nothing to take the training. If you want to get certified, it's maybe $109. Get some of those certifications so that you're hearing different perspectives from different thought leaders, whether it's professors or folks that work in this space. And then find yourself a good mentor or someone else that you can bounce ideas off of, and join councils if you can, right? Do some volunteer work or be on those councils so you can hear what other companies are doing, because building that network will help you if you want to look at future opportunities. And for individuals who are interested in coming to work in the intelligence community, I said, why not? At 38 and a half years, yeah, I've had some challenges in the organization, but for the most part, I've had the vast majority of my adult life there. I love the people like they're my family. The opportunities are endless. And when I say they're endless, it means that once you go out and do some research, kind of find out what your niche is. If you're interested in going overseas, look to see what all those different opportunities that are afforded for overseas assignments. If you're in technology, whether it's cyber, whether it's, electrical engineering, chemical engineering, mechanical, all those sorts of things, right? Look to see what the science and technology or chief information officer opportunities are. There are so many different opportunities in how you can grow in the organization. And at the CIA, one of the things that I found that for me was most exciting is we weren't expected to stay in our positions any more than 2 to 3 years. Unless you're an expert in the field, you got to go across different parts of the agency, the organization. Um, and that's how I was able to get the well-rounded experience that I had. Did a joint duty assignment at Department of Defense, right? So there's so many different things. Um, Make sure if you get a chance and if you're in school, travel, foreign languages, keep your grades up as much as you can, but also just, get to know more about world events and all of those sorts of things to help better prepare you.
Thank you. A question along those lines. Has your career left you optimistic or discouraged about the future of diversity and inclusion in leadership?
Well, internally, I think that we've, as CIA, I can speak for CIA, we've made a lot of progress. And in 2022, we actually promoted to our senior ranks 47% women and 27% minorities. And that was the highest that we had at any point in the agency. And so under the current director that we have, I just think the agency will continue to flourish. He's a phenomenal leader, and I will tell you, he's probably one of my favorite directors, and I've worked for about 5 of them. And so CIA, I think we're doing quite well. Is there still work to be done? Absolutely, right? The intelligence community, I think they're tackling some of these challenges and issues as well. So I think there's, again, room for improvement. But I think that people have to make sure that accountability is still built in. And as long as there is accountability and that people are willing to speak truth to power, and then really understanding that it is people first. For me, it was always people is mission, right? So I don't look at it as 2 separate things. And I think if you look at people as your mission, you can continue to move forward.
And along those lines, a nuts and bolts question. How do you convince the CEO that the Chief Diversity Officer and DEI efforts should be separate from HR?
Well, first of all, that's going to be hard depending on if you're that DEI. Well, first I would say, well, what's your value proposition and why is it placed? So for me, it would be more of questioning and understanding, so how to help me better understand why is this particular role placed within. But I think if you are planning on going to approach your CEO, I think you should come prepared with the reasons why it should not fall within. And for me, it would be, you can't police yourself. DEIA should be separate and apart from, if we're going to be fair and equitable, HR officers, are a part of the organization, just like any other element. And if I fall embedded within, I feel that I'm beholden to, right? Don't use these words, but I mean, you flesh it out a little bit in the sense of this person may not be a DEIA expert. And I think to show the workforce that you're serious about it, it has to be something that's separate and apart from. It has to be given the position of authority, empowerment, and should have a seat at the table. All of those different things to lend voice to the credibility of the role. And again, it's nothing against those chief HR officers. It's just that why? I can't, in my mind, understand the why that it's rolled into HR when it really is. When we talk about people, yes, talent management is a portion of it, but so is learning, but so is all of these other elements that would have a piece, recruiting, all of these things have a piece of DEIA. So why should any one part of the organization own it when really it should be an umbrella overarching of all of these parts of your organization? I don't know if that made sense. I feel like I'm muttering it up, but
No, I mean, you can't police yourself right there. in a nutshell, really great advice. And there's someone else, Cassandra, is asking for some nuts and bolts advice too. If you're a DEI department of one, how do you ensure that you have the needed support and buy-in?
And that goes back to my earlier statement that when companies, and if you're a small company, I understand, it's to scale one person, right? But if you really are serious about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, one person, you can't write out a strategy, you can't implement a strategy, you can't be expected to hold people accountable, you can't change policy. Your hands are tied to identify minimal things that you're only able to implement. They can give you $1 million. Okay, so I go out and get a contractor or someone to help with what? How do you prioritize when you're just one person and you can't keep up with the pace of business because now that someone's calling you about an issue or a challenge in their business area? And so the one person piece to me only makes sense if you're 100-person or smaller in an organization. Anything other than that, it's not enough resources. And that to me speaks to that, again, we are what we show through the resources that we put behind something.
And if
And one
you were,
person,
oh, sorry, Sonia,
go ahead.
if you were that one person in 100, what would you do? Just because you brought that up, like, what would you do if you were in that position?
So if I was 1 in 100, I put a call out to volunteers. And I would say, you know what? I can't do this alone in this organization. Did that at our agency, even though we had a team. And every directorate, mission center, and enterprise office, I identified 3 things that I thought were key priorities for the agency. And I said, I want all of you to do an action plan on how you're going to address diversity and lack of diversity in leadership, lack of accessibility, and then making your workplace inclusive. Identify 3 things, roll it out to those offices and say, hey, this is going to take teamwork. There's only one of me, but you can do grassroots things, and then come back to me and let me know what your initiatives are going to be and report them out on a quarterly basis, right? And so I had them report to me on a quarterly basis what their progress was against those topics, areas, or issues. And if they weren't moving the needle, then it's time for a one-on-one conversation. How can I help you get to a space where this is moving forward? Inclusivity. Well, let me give you some language on how to be inclusive in your workspace, or to make your meetings inclusive. Then you can start reporting back to me on what that looks like. Diversity in leadership. Are you spanning your workspace? Are you training folks? Intentional development of every individual. So there are things that you can do as a one person, but parse it out to others. So don't take all of that on yourself. I was fortunate to have a director and leadership that says, this is not just Sonia's responsibility. She is our chief diversity inclusion officer or deputy in this role. It's all of our responsibilities. And so I would report that back out at our corporate board meeting. And so some people may call it public shaming, but I call it accountability. And I would go in with flow charts. Here's some of the best practices that came out of this quarter. And here's the offices that have demonstrated those things, because those are attaboys for those offices that are doing well. And for those that aren't doing so well, then, maybe they have it gives them a little incentive to do a little bit more, or for that COO or whomever to go behind closed doors and kind of say, look, you need to work a little bit harder in this space.
Thank you. Another question, nuts and bolts. What would you suggest for interdepartmental collaboration with the agency's DEIA professional? Any institutional structures to be established that can help with interdepartmental collaboration for some of these larger organizations?
So collaboration definitely is going to be key. And so I think that If you have, yes, you should have probably different elements in different parts of the organization, and that collaboration definitely across different elements of it, sharing of ideas, sharing of practices, and looking for opportunities where they can um, use some of the same resources to advance DEIA. Absolutely.
Great. Okay. We can shift gears a little bit. We've got some other interesting questions. First, somebody asked about whether or not this will be recorded because they missed the first part. And you will definitely want to catch all of Sonia's interview. And yes, it will be posted on our website within the week. A couple of questions about inspiring young people. So from Rebecca, what do you wish younger generations knew about fighting for justice and systemic change? Do you see the same mistakes getting repeated again and again?
Well, what I wish that people knew was that yes, I do see some things repeating, and it's sad, but I think when we have change of power, things tend to fluctuate, um, and some voices get silenced. And then, of course, access to, I don't say experiences, but you only get to really, um, wherever you live, wherever you work, sometimes that's the only access that you have to what's going on around you, right? And so for me, I just wish that people were more attuned to what's happening outside of their sphere, and then volunteer in an organization or a group that may not look like you. I would tell folks at work, for example, join an employee resource group that you're not a member of, you know, by gender or by race, something that would give you some exposure to, so that in your day-to-day life that you can navigate in a different way, with your eyes a little more wide open, in the sense of understanding, um, and sometimes humility, compassion, empathy. All of those things come from exposing yourself. So I think sometimes when we get caught up in too much of what's in front of us, on what's on the computer, and we lose the people piece of things, right? Or just within our own community. Um, I just think that some of those things have evolved or revolved and gone back a little bit. Yes.
So cyclical, going back and forth. So you are seeing some of the same, but as your comments earlier, you've seen a lot of progress too, systemically. Long way to go. Kathy has a question about youth violence. I know the Secret Service has done some research into school shootings. Are there other examples of when federal organizations have worked on preventing youth violence?
That's outside of my wheelhouse, so I don't
Spoken,
think I would have an answer for that one.
spoken like a true professional, right? Yeah. You have this huge body of knowledge as an expert. That's outside of it. And I just point that out because it's such a great learning experience for some of the young people I'm mentoring. It's like, you don't actually need to know the answers to everything, because you have a lot of information you can't share with us because it's, I'm sure, top secret or classified, but outside of your wheelhouse, it's really, just to emphasize that it's really important to have that confidence to say that I don't know, for young folks who are coming up. Here's a tough question. We sort of got into this, but how do you reconcile the need for diversity in the CIA with the checkered history of the CIA when it comes to people of color? I assume they're referring to COINTELPRO. I'm not entirely sure, but something along those lines.
Yeah. So, so there is a perceived history of CIA, and then of course I know that there are probably some things, and so I can't speak about any of those sorts of things. But what I can say is, you have to be a part of the change that you want to see. And sitting on the sidelines and, my chief of staff, for example, Black female who came from Philly, she's a lawyer. And when she was approached to come work at the agency, one of the things that she said was, why do I want to go work there? They did X. And they were like, you can't help affect change and impact change from the outside, right? And so that's where all of those different thoughts, those different perspectives, all of those different things come to the table. Whether you come in as an analyst, an ops officer, you now have a place where your voice can be heard, right? And so what better way to do it than to be a part of the organization to say, no, I don't think this is the right way, and here's why. So you're bringing different perspectives to the table. And so for me, like I said, being there 38 and a half years, being able to be in the room, having a voice at the table, and knowing that I could sleep well at night because I know that I did my part.
Okay, so the advice is if you have an issue with an organization or an institution, get in there and change it. If you have an issue with the mission, get in, have a seat at the table so your voice is heard, and change it internally. A couple of other questions in our few remaining minutes. Do you follow or develop an equity toolkit?
I'm sorry, do I follow or?
Do you use an equity toolkit? They're probably, wanting a copy of it if you do.
I don't, but I do have probably some things I could probably put together. Most of the stuff that I had at the agency, of course, is still at the agency, right? So I'm building out my own new portfolio of things right now. So, like my own dashboard and that sort of thing. So I am building out some things. So right now I don't have anything concrete to be able to share, but I certainly, there are questions that you have for me, hit me up on LinkedIn, and if I'm able to address them, I will do that.
And you do a lot of corporate consulting now, so Sonya is available for that if you want her extensive expertise in your company. Susie asks a question. In hindsight, aside from exploring overseas opportunities, is there anything else you would have explored?
I think that for me was I waited too late in my career. I think I was a GS 15, and that's right before the senior executive level. And I was like, I had that itch. I wanted to go overseas. But at that point in time, I didn't have the foundational experience that was needed for any of the roles. I was already at a senior level position. And so for me, I think that was really just my big miss. Other than that, I'm excited and happy about, having been able to work in recruitment, science and technology, all of those things. So being able to check everything off with the exception of working overseas for a few years.
All right. Well, one last question. It appears that this interview has inspired someone who's further along in their career to want to work with the CIA or do something along those lines. They ask, is there also a space for older people in the CIA or other similar organizations? So in intelligence, what are the limits or opportunities for older people?
So the only area within the CIA that has an age restriction is our director of operations. And that's if you're coming in as an ops officer, and that's age 35, right? All the other elements of the organization, the sky's the limit. As long as you're 18 or older and can be polygraphed, opportunities are endless. I would say if you're looking at analysis, right, and our director of analysis, whether it's military, economics, leadership, and then there are a few political, right? So if those are your field of studies, let's see, areas of expertise, including regional studies, whether it's Middle Eastern or African studies or any part of the, other regions of the world, those sorts of things are things that they look at as well. Traveling abroad, foreign languages, those can fit into any parts of the organization. Technology, cyber, engineering of any sorts, and then AI, all of those different things that you hear out in the public now, they're also useful inside at the CIA. And then, of course, we have, just like any other company, you've got HR, you've got security, you've got medical, so we're just like any company. And so I would say just think about what your passion is. If you do decide to go to the website, take a look to identify at least 4, because you have the option to or opportunity to apply up to 4 positions. Please select 4 of them so that they can take a look at you for any of these opportunities, and then they can expand it out if your background meets any other things that they have. Must be a U.S. citizen, and must be willing to relocate to the Washington, D.C. area.
Okay, and also very importantly, be able to pass a polygraph.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Sonya. This has been an incredible conversation. Folks can find you on LinkedIn, and just a joy to talk with you. Thank you so much for taking the time today to share your expertise.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.